Hello dear listener. So, I'm gonna make a video about something that I find very interesting, but that most other people will find kind of larpy and ridiculous. But I think they have some merit in an environmental sense and in a luxury sort of cruise liner functionality, and that is Zeppelins. Love Zeppelins. I once tried to write a short story about Zeppelins, but I'm not really a fiction writer, as it turns out. It all turns into sort of a bad stage play if I try to write fiction. But Zeppelins are very, very interesting. And what I wanted to write about at the time was about the First World War, and it was this very interesting event where a Zeppelin captured a three-mast clipper, a sailing ship. And this was kind of the meeting of the old and the new world, like the ending of the sailing era and the beginning of the flying era meeting one another, and the Zeppelin, boarding this three-mast clipper, shooting at it with its machine guns and boarding it and forcing it to surrender during the First World War. And I read a lot about Zeppelins, how they were used in the First World War. They were very, very... Well, they weren't very useful as combat aircraft as such, really. They weren't very fast. But one thing Zeppelins could do much better than airplanes at the time is they could climb very, very high. They could exceed something like 4,000 meters in height. Climb the ceiling. At that height, oxygen is very rare and the cold is very high. So there's all these stories of Zeppelin crews, climbing up, trying to escape fighter planes, and their crews, fighting against passing out or freezing to death, just hoping that they can stay high enough, long enough to escape all these fighter planes, which they couldn't really fight against, because even though a Zeppelin is a huge target, so there's differences in what. So gas carrying ships, you've got dirigibles, which are Zeppelins, which have a rigid airframe, which is usually a light metal like aluminium frame filled with gas bags. And then you've got balloons, and you've got what's the name of them? I forget, but the point, that's not really the point. Zeppelins could take quite a bit of punishment because they're isolated gas bags. One puncture hole doesn't mean it's going to go down, and it's very, very large. Like the biggest Zeppelins were 130 to 200 meters long, so they could carry quite a few machine guns. First World War, the peak First World War designs, which are LZ 300 types and so on, could carry up to 8 heavy machine guns, basically MG8s, and they could fend off light aircraft while climbing. Very interesting stuff, very romantic. There were these trips of them going to Africa to resupply Leto Vorbeck in his guerrilla war, which then fails, fighting against shipping lanes in the Mediterranean and the North Sea, because these things have a huge range. They can really fly thousands and thousands of kilometers without really requiring any kind of resupply. Even today, a dirigible has a far longer range than any airplane, because they don't really need very much. If they're at a certain height, they'll just stay at that certain height. But why are dirigibles interesting in an environmental sense rather than all this sort of old World War I romantic stories about them, which there are far too few of, really? If there's any fiction writers who would run interesting topics to write about airships. There's really not enough fiction about airships, and there's plenty of stories to tell. But they're interesting because they are extremely cheap in terms of energy consumption. All they really need is a few electromotors, and they need hydrogen. Hydrogen can be produced a number of ways. The easiest way is the electrolysis of water, but it also escapes with the mining of petroleum and some other things. This is also the main source of helium, by the way. Helium is mostly found in natural circumstances by mining they're a byproduct of petrol production, and they can be synthesized as well. But hydrogen's pretty cheap. Electromotors to just run on electricity, of course, and they're only used for directions. So Zeppelins, very cheap. They're not very fast. Thing is, we have kind of shelved Zeppelin technology for 80 odd years. So really, we don't really know if we couldn't, improve the performance. There's a lot of things, like the Concorde airplane that could make the Britain to America line within a few hours. We've shelved a lot of quite advanced technology because simply they were too expensive, or we consider them obsolete and so on. But this whole conversation about environmentalism and overconsumption of energy, plastics and so on, makes it interesting to talk about alternatives. What sort of things can we do that are within a range of acceptable sacrifices, but still efficient enough to kind of maintain a modern economy. Now, if you want to get rid of, commercial airplane travel, which would actually solve quite a lot of pollution, because commercial airplane travel is quite polluting. Now, I personally disagree with the whole idea of going on holidays and so on. Anyway, kind of essentially, I think it's a very, very liberal conception of the world to think going on holiday is normal, that you should be welcome anywhere in the world, that going towards the sun for a few weeks is a normal thing to do. It's not even a very rational thing to do. It's a huge waste of resources, not only your own resources, but burning of energy and so on. Just for what? For leisure. There's nothing wrong with just going, like, if you're Dutch, go to the Ardennes or something, or go to the German forest or the Veluwe. I mean, there's nice places to go. I'm sorry, it's just not for everyone to be traveling the world. So commercial airplane travel, in my opinion, is a really ridiculous luxury anyway. But if you want to make a more environmental alternative to luxury travel to these destinations, Zeppelins are a far, far more energy friendly alternative. Now, they used to be able to go to South America in about 3 days, North America in about 2, from Northern Europe to Africa less than a day, few hours. Within Europe, they could be used as alternatives to airplane travel and trains as is, because they're about as fast in takeoff, landing and so on, and logistics. They're about as fast there as local airplane and train travel. They can travel at about, I think the Graf Zeppelin and the Hindenburg and so on could peak at about 160 kilometers an hour, which isn't super fast, but it's about as fast as commercial trains do. So they're an alternative there. They still consume less energy than trains as well, because again, the electromotors are only used for steering. When the hydrogen bags are full, they're full. There's no need to really refill them or anything. So they are extremely low in energy consumption, and they're capable of carrying quite extensive loads. I mean, they're not cargo airplanes, but the biggest Zeppelins could carry about 200 passengers, and several thousand kilos of cargo. And these were built to be luxury, of course. So the Graf Zeppelin, the Hindenburg, and so on, these were built for extreme luxury. They were like yachts of their time. So they couldn't carry that many passengers, but what they were carrying anyway was people with private quarters, dining rooms, smoking rooms, a small casino. It was made for extreme luxury. So if you make commercial air travel, of course you can carry far, far more passengers per Zeppelin than an airplane to begin with. A 737 carries about, I think, 300 passengers. So if you were to remodel a Zeppelin to focus passenger carry as much as commercial airplanes, so you could carry about, I think, probably 3 737s worth per Zeppelin. Now there's a safety issue people would of course start talking about, and that's hydrogen is explosive. Yeah, it is. Hydrogen's issue mainly is that it's a very, very tiny molecule. I've discussed this in terms of electrical car batteries as well with friends of mine who are into engineering and so on. And the problem with electrical cars, for example, is that lithium isn't a very abundant resource, and it's the best material we have for batteries. So people have suggested using hydrogen as a source or storage source for energy for cars as well. Now, hydrogen is plenty easy to obtain. As I said, it's just electrolysis of water. Problem is that hydrogen leaks through just about everything. If you put it in gas bags, and the Zeppelins that we've known used pig skins as gas bags, so of course those aren't going to be very sealant. We're going to have better materials to seal them today, but still, hydrogen can even leak through iron and steel containers. That's how small that molecule is. It can just slip through steel molecules. So you're always going to have constant leaking. Well, with modern plastics technology and compression and so on, we're going to have a lot easier time dealing with that sort of leakage than they'd have in 1914, but it's still a bit of a risk. Hydrogen is flammable. Alternative is using helium. The problem is helium is very, very expensive in comparison, and we use helium for a lot of things already. Helium is mostly used in MRI machines for coolant technology. That's one of their important functions, and in I believe they're used in laboratory conditions for certain things as well. And the stupidest thing in the world is the Americans have the largest supply of helium in the world, and they use it to inflate balloons for parties. This is another one of those examples of Americans being extremely irresponsible idiots. But anyway, helium is an alternative that could be used. It's just more expensive. Then again, you know, with all the money that people are willing to put up for green causes these days, with subsidies for all kinds of inefficient modes, like electrical cars are a pipe dream as an alternative solution in terms of transportation, especially individual transportation. There are simply not enough lithium to build all those car batteries. The expenses required to upgrade the entire network of electricity, to make sure that there are enough loading stations, that there's enough capacity in the network for all those cars, that's a huge expense. You'd have to replace all your ground cabling, all your transformation houses, all your just about everything. Your fuse boxes have to be upgraded. Your whole electrical network has to be upgraded for those cars. And that's then that's only the cars. If you want to have solar panels in Europe, so that's a whole story again. And then there's power generation. I mean, you can if you're going to have an electrical car that's powered by a coal-fired station that produces energy through thermic turbine generation, then still, what's the point? You're just burning coal at another place. You're still polluting, just not from the car directly, but indirectly. So electrical cars, in terms of production, in terms of raw materials necessary, in terms of the costs, it's just not a realistic solution. In that sense, a more realistic solution are metros, trams, more bicycles, these sorts of things. That's more of a cultural issue to get people to adopt those, though. Cars are just easy, so you make them more expensive, you know, at some point. And that's the same thing with airplanes and trains, which is really the point I'm trying to get at. If you're willing to make that much money available to subsidize electrical cars, why not subsidize, for example, Zeppelins? Zeppelins would be a very, very environmentally friendly alternative to commercial air travel. Well, probably never going to happen, because Zeppelins have kind of been written off as a technology. Rigid airframe balloons you only see them commercially sometimes, and I don't think there's a single actual Zeppelin in flight at the moment, not for commercial air travel, not as a tourism option or anything. And so, just a fantasy of mine probably, but I'd really like to fly on a Zeppelin sometime, and I think they're really interesting technology, and they exist for a very, very brief period of time. They only existed for about 25-30 years that they were really in active use. They spent about as much time as a war engine as a commercial flying engine. They weren't very great war engines, but they were interesting. The crews on them were very, very heroic. Very few of them actually returned to service. Service on a Zeppelin was about as deadly as on a U-boat, for a comparison. One you crash dive down into the ocean, the other crash dive up into the sky, and either way you can end up without oxygen and dying, or freezing to death, or whatever else. So that's interesting. And well, there's not much more to add there, I guess. Zeppelins are just kind of cool. They look cool. They've got a very small carbon footprint. Hydrogen could be contained. Helium is a fairly viable alternative. And there's cruise ships. So you've got cruise ships, of course, carry thousands of passengers, luxury. Basically, Zeppelins could be used maybe as if you want to find a commercially viable way to gather funds for Zeppelin researching and developing that technology. Cruise ship, sort of a Zeppelin cruise ship, might be an interesting model. It'd be more expensive than a regular cruise, but it'd also be, well, I mean, who wouldn't want to fly in a Zeppelin sometime, right? If you've got the money to spend, if you want like 5,000 euros or something to spend on a few days on a Zeppelin, or maybe a week, I think quite a few people would be willing to take that. You can invest that money into researching technologies. But again, it's not realistic that Zeppelins are actually going to be adopted again to any purpose, really, because airplanes have certain other advantages, mainly speed, even though they're more polluting and consume more energy. But again, maybe, airplanes fly on kerosene. If we run out of oil at some point, or oil becomes unviable and we don't find an alternative energy solution to oil, maybe airplanes become impossible to use. That's one of those things. We're looking currently as a Western society to find alternatives to oil in just about every economic system we have, but mainly transportation and logistics, which are the hardest thing to replace oil in. And we're trying to replace it with electricity in most cases, even though the power generation side of things is really not being looked at sufficiently. But if petrol oil runs out, you don't have the raw materials to make kerosene, then you can't have airplanes flying. So I guess in that case, Zeppelins do become an actual viable alternative, because water electrolysis is extremely simple. You put a few batteries in water, you run a current through water, you basically separate the H and the O molecules, and there you have a hydrogen and oxygen, basically. Well, that's that. Zeppelins. If any engineers if any government officials want to get in touch with me to help develop Zeppelins, let me know. Absolutely up for it.